We're going to start the program today with a video welcome by Port Authority Chairman Kevin O'Toole, and then immediately after that, Executive Director Rick Cotton is here, and he'll provide some opening remarks as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Kevin O'Toole. I'm honored to serve as the chair of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. We are doing this virtual today, but I promise in the fall, the executive director and I will be at Rutgers and NYU as we do the symposiums in person, long overdue. First of all, I want to thank the Port Authority staff who have put this together, namely Alfred Doblin and others who have made this a reality. We're talking about the 100 years of the Port Authority, which covers a lot of territory and obviously a lot of time. You know, last couple of months ago, we went and celebrated with a monument outside the Oculus, this stone that says celebrating 100 years as the Port Authority, the agency. It takes us back to 1921 when the government and the state in New Jersey and New York came together and said, we want to have a bi-state agency that's going to create a transportation hub for this area and for this country. And when you look at what they did in terms of just creating the infrastructure with, you know, the Goethals and the outer crossing bridge and the Lincoln and the Holland, they've acquired these assets in the 30s and 40s and acquired the path in 1962, put together the bus terminal in the 50s, put together the port itself in the 50s and 60s, and linked all of these very separate lines of transportation and kind of linked them under this one umbrella. It's pretty extraordinary. The Port Authority is the most extraordinary place that does extraordinary things. You're going to hear during the symposium about what the history has been filled with. Obviously, some times of great construction, great movement, some bitter times, obviously the bombings and the deaths and pandemic and other things that have occurred. But we are now filled with great hope as we come out of this pandemic, that we are now planning for the next 100 years. You know, whether you're talking about 2 air trains in New York and New Jersey, you talk about new airports that are being totally redone, world-class opportunities for path and port and the tunnels and the bridges and the George Washington. It's an exciting time, exciting place. So we welcome the comments. We're looking forward to hearing some of the educated scholars talk about what the last 100 years have brought to the Port Authority and to this region. And now we're also using this as a brick and mortar's foundation to talk about what's going to happen during the next 100 years. So we thank you very much for taking part in today's symposium, and we look forward to seeing you in person in the fall. Thanks again.
All right. Well, I'd say thank you to Chairman O'Toole. He's not present, but I thank him anyway. And now we go to Rick Cotton, who is going to also give us some opening remarks.
John, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. I want to thank the Vorhees Transportation Center as well as Rutgers for co-hosting this event, and look forward very much to the comments and the summaries. It is humbling to serve as executive director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, to look back on 100 years. It is astonishing that in the first 10 years of the organization's existence, it built 3 bridges, one of which was the longest longest bridge in the world at the time that it was built. And we aspire to live up to the extraordinary history and accomplishments of the agency. What falls, hopefully everybody knows, within its purview is 5 airports, including the 3 major airports of Newark, JFK, and LaGuardia, our 4 bridges and 2 tunnels, the PATH commuter railroad, the largest bus terminal in the world, George Washington Bridge being the busiest bridge in the world, the seaport which is the busiest on the East Coast, second busiest in the country, as well as our commuter railroad. So as well as the 16-acre World Trade Center campus. And we feel the responsibility to move all of those up the curve. We have an extraordinary ambition in terms of our capital program. a complete rebuild of LaGuardia, extraordinary new facilities at Newark Airport, $5.5 billion worth. We have the ambition to move comprehensive redo of Kennedy, and we have put forward a very new, creative design for totally 100% replacing the Midtown bus terminal, which is way overdue. We have an improvement program underway at PATH. So that is the framework for the challenge we've taken on. The pandemic has done just unprecedented damage to our revenues. The fact is that what the pandemic did was it drove at the beginning our airport passenger volume down by 98%. It drove our commuter railroad volume down by 95%. It drove the vehicle volume over the bridges and through the tunnels down by nearly a third. The seaport was down 18%. The seaport has recovered significantly, but all of that loss of volume produced what will be by next March a $3 billion loss of revenue. We are self-sustaining. Every single penny that our revenues exceed our expenses goes into our capital plan. The reduction in revenue has put huge pressure on our capital plan. But despite that, we are moving forward, and I am optimistic that we will, that over time at least, the agency will recover. But our ambition is to live up to our history, to press forward, and to deliver world-class transportation assets to the region. That's our responsibility. Many of our legacy assets, such as the airport, such as the bus terminal, really were subpar as legacy assets. But we are committed to working as hard as we can to move up the curve to really state-of-the-art transportation facilities. We appreciate your undertaking a look back at the first 100 years, and we will be pushing forward to try to live up to the reputation that the agency has built over that period of time. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity. Glad that everyone who is on this Zoom call can join in terms of understanding the heritage of the agency. And thank you again for taking this on, and wish you a good session.
Thank you so much, Rick. We really appreciate it. I have no doubt that the agency will emerge from the last year in the same positive way it's emerged from adversity in the past. We have our next session will be, or our first session really, will be 2 keynote talks by Jim Hughes, who is a university professor at Rutgers and is the former dean of the Edward J. Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy here at Rutgers. I've known Jim for 30 years now. Very glad to have him as part of the program. And also Rosemary Scanlon, who is the former chief economist for the Port Authority. Jim's going to be kind of presenting a set of slides, and then we'll bring Rosemary on for her talk. And at this point, Jim, you can take over sharing the screen.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Let me start off by offering all of you congratulations. Since you are still vertical and have not yet gone toes up, you survived 2020, the worst single economic year in the 100-year history of the Port Authority. Simultaneously, you have also endured the worst overall economic downturn since the Great Depression. So, good riddance to 2020. Welcome to 2021, the first year of the Port Authority's second century. We certainly have high hopes for you. So, start off question, how did we get to where we are today? In the past 100 years, the Port Authority and the nation have been on a sustained, tumultuous, multidimensional economic roller coaster ride. Barely paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death, taxes, and a continuation of the business cycle. Business cycle never pauses, it never stops, continuously moving back and forth from contraction to expansion. So each phase of the cycle has had short-term implications, as well as helping to formulate longer-term structural economic eras. As you all know, the Port Authority was born in April 1921, and that was in the late stages of the severe 18-month-long January 1920, July 1921 recession. Thus, the Port Authority's gestation started when the economy was in a deep contraction, a contraction resulting from three severe economic disruptions: World War I demobilizations, the Spanish flu pandemic, and third, misguided contractionary monetary policies pursued by the Federal Reserve Board. But this early recession was just the start of a century-long roller coaster ride. The Port Authority would ultimately experience 17 and one half economic cycles as defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And these comprised 18 recessions and 17 expansions. During the first 50 years, the Port Authority had to navigate 10 and one half cycles, 10 expansions and 11 recessions, and then 7 full cycles during the second 50 years, 7 expansions and 7 recessions. But this cyclical roller coaster ride has a second widescreen dimension, broad threshold social and economic transformations. We can identify 9 regional structural eras, starting with the Roaring 20s, number 1, and finishing with number 9, the fundamental reset spawned by the great COVID-19 driven contraction. So let's briefly review each. The end of the 2021 recession, that's the 1920-21 recession, marked the start of Era 1, a transformative social and economic period popularly known as the Roaring 20s, 21 to 29. The Roaring 20s thus defined the first decade of the Port Authority's century-long march to the future. The Roaring 20s also marked the culmination of a vast early 20th century structural transformation of the American society. The century across the United States, 25 million horses provided most local transportation. Fortunately, a solid waste disposal problem never really occurred. One reason was 27 million horseless carriages had replaced those horses by 1929, the end of the Port Authority's first century. One impetus for this transformation was the introduction of the famous and affordable Model T Ford in 1908, and then the first assembly line in 1914, which truly revolutionized car manufacturing. But during the Roaring 20s, the automobile industry became the backbone of the new consumer goods-oriented society. Demand for road infrastructure intensified, state highway departments flourished, and their importance grew. Innovative road improvements were made throughout the region. Automobile-centric residential suburbanization began as urban spillover into adjacent territories unfolded. Market demand for bridge and tunnel infrastructure defined the fundamental rationale of the Port Authority. But the Great Depression, Era 2, terminated the Roaring 20s. Old adage, economic wild parties are often followed by prolonged economic hangovers, and this was the prolonged hangover of the ages. The social safety net was non-existent. This was the everyday New York City Depression reality, the social network at work. But the nation and the region soon ascended the learning curve. New Deal federal programs gained momentum, and the use of infrastructure investment as an economic locomotive proved to be an effective instrument. Of course, before we got sophisticated, infrastructure investment was then simply called public works. Eventually, the New Deal and then World War II led to the end of the Great Depression, and the end of the decade of the 30s. The third era to envelop the Port Authority began in 1940, military industrialization, port logistics, and unprecedented global conflict. America's response to World War II was probably the most massive economic mobilization in the history of the world. All hands on deck for military production. The Port Authority region was one of the epicenters of America's arsenal of democracy. We were a manufacturing colossus. Some industrial and logistical icons of Era 3, Brooklyn Navy Yard. This shipyard and industrial complex employed 75,000 workers at the peak of World War II. Brooklyn Army Terminal, the nation's largest military supply base during World War II, and Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Kearney Point, New Jersey. At its peak, it employed 52,000 workers in 1943 and was building ships at a world record-breaking pace. There's much more about this era, but time is limited. Era 4, the post-war consumer-driven economy and full auto-centric residential suburbanization spanned 1945 to 1970. Powerful pent-up consumer demand built up during the Depression and World War II exploded. Consumer goods manufacturing reigned. A key dynamic that underlied this period, immediately after World War II, G.I. Joe and Rosie the Riveter got together. America went into heat. 9 months later, births erupted. Over the next 18 years, a demographic event of epic proportions ensued. The fabled post-war baby boom. As the boom commenced, housing was immediately shaped by the requirements of child rearing. The baby boom roared, tract house suburbia emerged. Like the creature from the Black Lagoon, tract house suburbia oozed across the Port Authority region. The suburban-centric baby boom would then continuously reshape the built geography and transportation flows of the region for the balance of the century. Automania ruled this post-war era, with toll roads defining the next generation of highway development. One important aside, a signature policy event of this era occurred in 1965 with 21st century ramifications. In October, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act was enacted. This slide shows LBJ signing the act under the Statue of Liberty. It greatly increased immigration from nations that had systematically been excluded from the United States, and international immigration would become the demographic locomotive of the 21st century in the Port Authority region and beyond. But new economic and political events and traumas shocked the nation as the 1960s came to an end. The nation and region entered Era 5, the new economic reality. Stagflation, energy crises, emerging global competition, and painful economic transformations defined the era. A grumpy era, a very, very grumpy era. The region's manufacturing economy began to hemorrhage obsolete industrial age jobs and factory inventory, and Sunbelt and Frostbelt were added to our economic lexicon. Icons of the era, New York City's fiscal crisis and the very innovative federal response plan for that crisis. Widespread residential abandonment in the region's urban areas, political consternation, unhappy, puzzled faces, New York City carnage in the shadow of the newly erected Twin Towers, and Jersey City carnage in the shadow of the Twin Towers. It was also the birth dearth decade, a decade of demographic flatlining in the Port Authority region and the Northeast. But out of this economic despair, a new economic world surprisingly beckoned. Era 6, Auto-Centric Post-Industrial Economic Suburbanization, 1980 to 2000. During the final 2 decades of the 20th century, a badly aging manufacturing economy was remarkably transformed into a leading-edge post-industrial economy. As we all know, this new economy was largely sheltered by the region's great 1980s suburban office building boom. The goldfinch is New Jersey's official state bird, and the eastern bluebird is New York State's official state bird. In the 1980s, they were supplanted by the crane, the suburban construction crane. Corporate America was fleeing a desperate, struggling urban America, and the region's suburban freeway and highway-oriented suburban office agglomerations and growth corridors flourished as the interstate highway system was built out. This was the nation's leading edge, cutting edge growth model at the time. Auto-dependent, one-dimensional office corridors and concentrations. These defined the regional economic growth locomotive of this 20-year period. Moreover, by 1990, the middle of the era, enclosed super-regional malls had emerged as dominant retail meccas. The second part of Era 6, 1990 to 2000, was driven by the then record 120-month-long 1991 to 2001 economic expansion, a transmillennial economic expansion. However, its second half was actually fueled by the high technology dot-com bubble, which ultimately caused its demise. Unfortunately, its demise led to the struggling start to the new millennium. Era 7, the first 10 years of the new century, can be labeled the lost economic decade. It was the first decade in history that had fewer jobs at its end than it had at the beginning. That was true for the nation, the states, and the Port Authority region. It was also a double era, double bursting bubbles. In 2000 and 2001, dot-com became dot-bomb, which led to the short-lived 2001 recession. Then the 6-year recovery that followed was driven by an unprecedented housing and credit bubble. Old adage, you never know you're in a bubble economy until it bursts. And the bursting of the housing and credit bubbles led to the 2007-2009 Great Recession, which, before the present debacle, was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and it fully wiped out all pre-recession job gains. But just as the troubled 70s yielded to the economic advancements and transformations of the 1980s, so too the troubles of the 2000s yielded to the economic advancements and transformations of the 2010s, Era 8. The Great Recession was unexpectedly followed by the 128-month-long 2009 to 2021 record great economic expansion, June of 2009 to February 2020. This new record-long expansion spanned the entire second decade of the new millennium. Demographically, aging baby boom protocols were supplanted by those of ascending millennials. A second-generation post-industrial economy emerged, driven by sustained advances in digital-driven information technology. Globally, the rise of superstar cities characterized the decade, with New York City the nation's leading superstar. An urban resurgence took place throughout the Port Authority region during the decade, while its suburban territories flatlined. 3 examples of this transformational reversal. Number 1, Jersey City waterfront in the 1970s, Jersey City waterfront in the 2010s. Second example is the sparkling 1.5 million square foot corporate headquarters building built for Continental Insurance in 1988 in Cranberry, New Jersey. 2018, 30 years later, a case example of the incredible shrinking outer suburban office footprint. Suburban office market, overbuilt and under-demolished, overbuilt and under-demolished, caboose on the regional economic train. The new corporate locational preferences of the era, creative, innovative urban environments. The regional office ecosystem was dramatically transformed. Third example, regional malls, their shelf lives began to expire. But then another old adage reared its ugly head. We have yet to invent a boom that lasts forever. The Great Expansion was done in by an unforeseen assassin, the global coronavirus pandemic. This led to Era 9, the Great Contraction and Fundamental Reset, and it began in February 2020 as the first deliberately engineered recession unfolded. We were soon staring into the economic abyss. 10 years of job growth nationally were erased in the next 2 months. I'll spare you the grim details of what happened in the region. Suffice it to say, in April 2020, just when I was convinced the economy was doomed, something happened, something which shocked me. The world neglected to come to an end. In May, we did start to emerge from the economic dumpster, although forecasts of when this would actually happen did vary widely among the region's forecasters. I think that substantiates the old saying that if you took all the forecasters in the region and laid them end to end, they'd still point in different directions. Actually, truth be told, there are 3 kinds of forecasters in the region, 3 kinds. Those who can count and those who can't. And all 3 types have never demonstrated any visible skills in forecasting turning points in the business cycle. Nonetheless, post-2020, a fundamental reset appeared to be taking place. The way we work, the way we live, the way we shop, and the way we play may have been permanently transformed. As you all know, COVID-19 has expedited the future. It has acted as a gasoline on the fire accelerant. Remote work practices went into overdrive, and work became recognized as more of an activity rather than as a place, an activity rather than a distinct place. And this could rank as one of the great office market ecosystem disruptors of all time. COVID-19 also accelerated the surge in e-commerce as fulfillment centers expedited the delivery of happiness. As an aside, what marketing genius invented the virtuous term fulfillment center? It essentially suggests happiness delivered to the region. Concurrently, the great retail apocalypse intensified, the painful bricks and mortar meltdown. Clicks increasingly replaced brick. Another acceleration of trend, millennials had already begun entering the family raising stage of the life cycle and had just begun their suburban odyssey. However, many other millennials had been sitting on the fence. Now the pandemic has pushed them off the fence. Bottom line, the single-family unit home ownership, and surging suburban home prices are potentially reshaping the region's residential landscape. Key question is, will maturing millennial location choices morph into post-pandemic office locales? Will there be a comeback of satellite suburban ground scrapers? A key question. But one final question, will history repeat itself? Will it be economic deja vu all over again, as that famous Yankee forecaster has prognosticated? Will the post-pandemic roaring 20s define the start of the PA's second century? While the parallels to the 1920s appear to be striking, we still have many doubters. In fact, I think more residents of the Port Authority region believe they were abducted by aliens than believe the roaring 20s are about to reemerge. That's actually John Carnegie in the slide, being pulled kicking and screaming into the alien mothership. Okay, time is getting short, so now it's time for me to utter those words you have been longing to hear, perhaps desperately longing to hear. In conclusion, I think it's well recognized that I'm the only totally objective person in the Port Authority region. And it is my totally objective opinion that the Port Authority has now entered its 9th and most crucial transformative era. As you can see, Morgan Freeman fully agrees with me. So with his full assessment and endorsement, I'm going to go out on a limb, way out on a limb, and give you my totally objective opinion. During this reset era, COVID-19 and the COVID-19 engines of economic disruptions are likely to be transformed into the engines of economic creativity and advancement. And these engines that will emerge will fully define the Port Authority's 9th era, its 11th decade, and its 18th cyclical economic expansion. They will provide unprecedented economic challenges as well as unprecedented opportunities. Technological and economic megaforces have been released this past year. And post-vaccination, we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. Now, I promised John earlier that I'd finish on time, no matter how long it took. Well, I'm on time, certainly on budget. So welcome to the future, which is gaining momentum this year, and welcome to the Port Authority's 2nd century. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. As always, very astute in your observations and very punctual in your conclusion. Excellent job. Thank you so much. We're going to do questions after Rosemary's presentation. So at this point, we'll shift over to Rosemary for her talk.
Thank you, John. And thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so pleased to be part of this event with Rutgers and celebrating the 100th year of the Port Authority. And I want you to know that that I'm not the historian for the Port Authority by any means. There are plenty of other professional historians in the region and institutions to document the accuracy of the Port Authority's programs and investments over the decades. So my comments today will reflect my experiences during these important years for the Port Authority, and my views on the important role that the Port Authority has played in the economy and the further development of the New York metropolitan region. I joined the Port Authority in March of 1969, and I stayed for 24 years. And I think I was typical of my colleagues at the time. We considered it was a lifetime career. And I think most of us considered ourselves to be regional civil servants in the highest form of that term. And although I too am an economist, my job all those years at the Port Authority was to be an economist, I will not cover the same ground as my longstanding regional colleague, Jim Hughes, has just done. But rather, I would like to view the Port Authority's programs and actions during my years there in the context of the New York City and metro area economy that Jim has laid out for us. Also, I'm not using slides. Jim has done that with much accuracy and to much enjoyment. So forgive me, but I'm going to be a talking head for the next few minutes. So, as with Jim, I did spend my years monitoring, writing about, and forecasting the city and regional economy and population. And over those 24 years, I covered, I guess, 3 of those recessions, of the 18 recessions that Jim talked about, and plus the bare beginnings of the 3rd expansion during the Port Authority's 100 years. I left in August of '93, and we were just slowly coming out in the region of that early 90s recession. When I joined the Port Authority in 1969, New York City was enjoying an 8-year-long economic expansion. Unemployment rates were about 3%, and there was almost no housing available, something familiar to all of our young audience now. The beginnings of 2 strong decades of suburban expansion were just evident, as Jim has pointed out. The World Trade Center was in its earliest stages of construction. I visited the site that summer of 1969 to see the 90-foot hole in the ground, which I remember as being 90 foot, and the structures that were being put in place to hold back the Hudson River. The Port Authority had just taken over the bankrupt Hudson and Manhattan tubes, now renamed as PATH. And the PA, of course, was still benefiting from its major investments of earlier decades, the Holland Tunnel, the George Washington Bridge, the Bayonne Bridge, the Staten Island bridges, the Lincoln Tunnel, the airports, our 3 airports, and Ports Elizabeth and Newark. And as Jim pointed out, most of these investments had been made during the Great Depression or during the 2 post-World War recessions, the early 1920s, which, as Jim pointed out, was really severe and deep. And then in 1945, 46, maybe not as deep and not as long, because there was plenty of pent-up savings and pent-up demand, which pulled us out quickly. But the Port Authority, when I look back and what everybody has told me and everything I've read about those years, these were all brave, forward-looking investments and pivotal for the growth of the city and regional economy. And all of this was made possible by the unique nature of the Port Authority's financial structure and the nature of the Port Compact that was struck in 1921. As young staffers in my early days, we were all briefed by senior staff on the Port Authority's early days and that institutional structure and those early investments. And I say unique financial structure, but strictly speaking, it was almost unique because the DEF decision in 1921 or 22 to issue revenue bonds based on toll receipts or fees, other fees, was modeled on the just issued revenue bonds of the Port of London Authority, which in 1921 issued either a 70-year bond or a 100-year bond. It issued a couple in those years. One of each issued them in those early years. And if time permits, at the end of our presentations, I'll be happy to share an interesting story on that that happened while I was working in London for a while. I mean, the other unique part about the Port Authority's financial structure is that it has never relied on fiscal revenues from either state, New York or New Jersey, or from any city in the Port District. And it wasn't until the PFC, the Passenger Finance Charge, was approved for airports nationwide was there ever any revenue that could be remotely considered federal, and that revenue was tied to usage at our own airports. And again, as young staffers, we were treated to the near mythical Port Authority war stories, right, of the time, of the great engineers of the bridges and the tunnels, that early period, of the brilliance and the farsightedness of Austin Tobin, executive director for a long time, and the Tozzoli brothers, as they made the investment in the container ports, or made the decision to invest in the container ports before Malcolm McLean's first container ship rolled off the slips. And also of how the decision was made for the location of the World Trade Center. This is one story I know firsthand, and it was told to me by Ted Alcott when he was our director in the Planning and Development Department. As everybody who worked for the Port Authority knows, the early plans for the World Trade Center were to place it on the East River, and it was to be more a trade mart than any other concept. But there were loud objections, and understandably, from New Jersey, you're going to put these towers on the East River. And at the same time, New Jersey was dealing with the bankruptcy of the Hudson and Manhattan tubes with no solution in sight. So Ted Alcott, who was then, he then headed the Transportation Planning Division of the Planning and Development Department, told me that he met with Governor Hughes of New Jersey in the backseat of a car on the West Side Highway or West Street. And they made the agreement that the World Trade Center would be located on the Hudson River and that the Port Authority would fully assume ownership and rehabilitation of the tubes. It's a great story. Back to 1969 for a minute, because that turned out, as Jim pointed out, to be the peak of the New York City economy. After that, the city's economy plunged into a nearly 7-year recession, cost the city 600,000 jobs, which was the same size then of the city of Boston or the city of San Francisco. And by 1980, the city had lost over 800,000 people. There was no longer a housing shortage. And by 1975, the city was facing foreclosure on its municipal bonds, that great Daily News photograph, front page that Jim has shown us, forward to city, drop dead, an amazing time and period. And with such difficulties, the suburbs were suffering too. Now, in 1975 was the year that the World Trade Center was pretty much completed. There was much criticism in New York City real estate circles about the volume, the 10 million square feet that the Trade Center was putting into the market. So sometime during that year of 1975, I was kicked out of the nest to speak at a national conference in Philadelphia. And during which a very angry man stood up in the middle of my presentation and yelled to me and the room that the World Trade Center office volume was, quote unquote, ruining the city's real estate market. I somehow recovered my wits and remembered my statistics. And I told him in the room that the city of New York had just experienced a boom in new office construction of about 100 million square feet of new build, and of which the World Trade Center's 10 million square feet were exactly 10%. The audience clapped and the man sat down. So by 1977, after this awful recession period, when Peter Goldmark joined the Port Authority as executive director, the concern in the region was first of all, how can New York City recover after all of this? How can the metropolitan region recover? And what does the Port Authority do next? Big questions. So Mr. Goldmark launched what he called a committee of the future with 5 task forces of Port Authority staff drawn from most departments. One was on transportation, and a couple were on internal institutional. And I led the Regional and Economic Development Task Force, which we dubbed the Red Task Force, looking at 2 sides of the issue. One, we did a 10-year forecast of what we thought would happen to the city and regional, the city's economy and its population over that 10 years. And the other side was looking at what potential opportunities might lie for the Port Authority during that 10-year period. I have to tell you, I'm still proud of that economic forecast, because at the time when we released it, the well-known national economic forecasters were all saying New York City would never recover during the 1980s, whereas we had recovery in both the city's economy and in its population growth. So on the economic development opportunities side, we suggested a number of new areas for the Port Authority, chief of which was waterfront development. And the Port Authority was to build the successful waterfront development at Hoboken. And also we kickstarted what is now the successful development at Long Island City in Queens, while we were deep into my next team deep into the feasibility study for that. New York State decided to take over. that particular project. And also, among other ideas, we identified the importance of investing in infrastructure. The term infrastructure became a really big term that year. And I would say, and as Jim pointed out, it replaced the phrase public works or utilities. Jim, I was as guilty as any of us in those years of using the term infrastructure, and I'm convinced in the last 20 years, we haven't built anything nationally to really repair our declining facilities. So maybe if we go back to calling them utilities and road works, et cetera, we'll do a better job in the future of building it. But meanwhile, while my Red Task Force was working on all of this, the Port Authority had two other teams at work. One team planning for industrial development parks and another for resource recovery facilities, which we were to go ahead and build one, but very, very path-breaking in its way at the time. So then we get to the mid-1980s, and by that time, there was a clear need to begin renovating our three major airports. And at that time, the Port Authority was being much criticized for not providing rail access to the airports. So right about that time, and by this time, Martin Robbins was our department director, we launched in the Planning and Development Department a regional competition study to look at the growth of other major metropolitan areas in the United States. For example, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Miami, Jacksonville, Norfolk. We even looked at Halifax, Nova Scotia for what was happening in the port industry there. And we put lots of our teams at work within the Planning and Development Department, but we also had a lot of good insight and assistance from our colleagues in the major line departments, aviation, port, path, et cetera, bridges and tunnels. So, we, I mean, out of that, not out of our work, but out of the concern over the airports and the criticism over lack of rail access, came the investment first of the air train at Newark International Airport. And then a few years later, the air train from JFK to Jamaica Station. And I recall all during those years that there were constant upgrades being made to our crossings, and that we had successfully poured substantial capital into the splendid new path system. I also recall that there always seemed to loom issues about the Port Authority bus terminal, and particularly during the mid and late 1980s, when homelessness became such an issue, not just in New York City, but around the major cities in the country. So I finished my years at the Port Authority in August of 1993. And yes, I was there for the bombing of February 26th of that year, and needing to evacuate and successfully evacuate from my office on the 67th floor, but safely, along with some 50,000 other occupants. And then I went to London after that, but then, of course, for the Port Authority came the catastrophe of 9/11. And those next days were incomprehensible, that the towers had been destroyed, that so many people had lost their lives. I have such respect for the Port Authority commissioners, the Port Authority executives and staff who regrouped to rebuild amidst that profound sadness and what must have seemed endless days when the planning seemed endless and much criticized at the time, whether they're ever going to plan this and get it going. But when I first visited the rebuilt site, my respect and admiration for the Port Authority, its leadership, the commissioners and the executives, its exceptional staff, its financial strength, its courage, as well as the vision and determination of Larry Silverstein, was a profound sensation of deep respect for my colleagues from my former agency. Well, it's time for me to wrap up now. but not before, before I want to make the strong case for what I witnessed during my 24 years at the Port Authority. I witnessed that this was an agency, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, deeply committed to its 1921 compact, to the investments needed to develop the New York City and metropolitan region economy, that this commitment and these investments were made on the basis of the Port Authority's own financial strength and access to the financial marketplace, that the Port Authority could still dream up and accomplish this strategic thinking and planning and new ventures that would boost the Port Authority region, just as the agency had done in the 1920s and 1930s, and with its bold strategic investments in the airports after World War II and in the container ports during the 1950s. And then in the World Trade Center, when the vision of the Port Authority was that the future of trade would lie in the functions of finance and professional services, not just the goods handling functions, and that thus offices would be necessary to provide for that transportation and world trade functions. I was also proud of my own economics team, who together with several good colleagues in New York City, such as Mitch Moss of NYU and Hugh O'Neill, who had been the Deputy Executive Director at the Port Authority for a number of years, and Jim Hughes and his colleagues at Rutgers, who were early in identifying the transformation of the urban economy from goods producing to service producing, and thus underpinning those massive investments in office construction taking place in both the city and the suburban areas. Well, I'm also well aware now that we are in a new era. I look forward to seeing the new LaGuardia Airport, to watch the development of the Hudson Tunnel, aka Gateway, that Martin Robbins and a small team launched at the Port Authority, I think in our old planning and development department in the early 1990s. Martin will tell us all about this. I look forward to the decisions being made on the bus terminal and what's going to happen there. And I also look forward to learning about the mysterious future of WTC number 5. So, and any and all other innovations and investments by the Port Authority. But my concluding hope is that someday some historian will write a major account of Austin Tobin's legacy to match that of Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses. Austin Tobin was surely the unsung hero of so much development in the Port District for so many decades. His legacy deserves a major recognition. So good afternoon to all. It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Rosemary, thank you so much. Really appreciate your thoughts and insights and your years of experience and perspectives sort of on the last several decades in particular. We now have time for some questions and answers for all of folks that are signed on as attendees. Please feel free to use the question and answer dialog box. You can do that by clicking on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and typing your question. We'll sort of bring those in as they come in, directed to Jim and Rosemary. And while we're waiting for some questions from the audience, I have two questions for you guys, just reflecting on what I just heard you say. And I'm going to direct them to. I'll direct the first question to Jim and then to Rosemary, and you guys should certainly feel free to answer each other's question, the other's question as well. But to get started, Jim, I'm wondering, based on the work you did in preparing for today's session, and kind of reflecting on the responses that happened in the region to the economic changes and all that sort of stuff. And I recognize that forecasting is crystal ball, and you may not want to do that. But I wondered if you could sort of give some thought to, based on your experience, what what changes may come if indeed this is a fundamental reset in terms of the region's development pattern and settlement patterns and things like that. I know that we've been talking about it on and off for the last year or so, but I wonder if you could reflect on what you think the future might hold and what the Port Authority's response might need to be to that.
Well, I think basically the office ecosystem where most of the new economy of the past 15 years is located is undergoing a fundamental transformation. I think central hubs, bringing people in 5 days per week for 9 to 5 work days and the like, is an endangered species. We're obviously going to see much more remote work, maybe not as much as the past year, but certainly compared to pre-pandemic patterns of work. We're going to see a great addition of remote working. And that probably makes a lot of sense. But what that may imply is the central hubs, particularly in Manhattan, for many organizations and for many industries, it would be the hub as a club. Won't be a particular full-time work environment because much private work can be done very productively at home, but it would be a place for onboarding new employees, for building organizational cultures, for collaborative environments and the like. So we're going to see that type of transformation impact the entire work ecosystem. So transformation of work, I think, is going to be a dominant force. And at this stage, obviously, as you just said, forecasting is difficult, and I predict it's always going to be difficult. That's going to be the area that's going to be focused on, and that's going to have transportation implications. It's going to have physical space implications. It's going to have residential location implications, and that will define the future region. However, we have so much fixed infrastructure in place, fixed housing in place, fixed offices in place, that we're going to see minor shifts in that, at least in the next decade or so, since we have so much fixed investment basically in the ground. So the functions and needs of the Port Authority are going to remain as they were pre-pandemic, but going forward, they're going to be continuously modified.
Great, thanks, Jim. And Rosemary, my follow-up question really was to that response, and
Sure.
I wonder what it implies. Go ahead if you want.
Yeah, first of all, I totally agree with Jim. Right, I think the big office network system is really, and people I talk to are reluctant to go back to an office, especially on a five day a week basis. But I see a parallel development at work in the last 3 months or so, and in my neighborhood, and then in Brooklyn Heights, the neighborhoods just south, Cobble Hill, Carroll Gardens, etc. First of all, people working at home have stimulated a lot of spending in the neighborhoods, right? All of the little restaurants that have built out on the sidewalks are filled now every single night. There's, while we worry very much about poverty and the inequality in the city, nonetheless, the middle class, right, who working at home have stored up income so that there's money to spend. We could become the roaring 20s again. In that sense, there's pent-up demand. But I think that the neighborhoods are really going to be strengthened throughout Brooklyn and Queens. And I've even been told this happening in the Bronx. I'm sure it's happening in other neighborhoods in Manhattan, while the worry seems to be over Midtown. So, and there's also substantial construction. You can hardly move a block in downtown Brooklyn without major construction. Offices, believe me, as well as housing. And I'm told by friends from Queens, the same thing in Queens. So the neighborhoods are going to be much strengthened in this reset, right? once Broadway opens in September, that's going to mean a lot for the restaurants, right? And the taxis and some of the other, and the hotels in Midtown Manhattan. That will help, even if some of the offices are still empty. And because of all of that, just to end, I think there's huge pent-up demand for air travel, so that we're going to see people flooding, including me, back into the airports if I can remember how to do it.
Right. So on that note, it sounds like I'm wondering how these things impact on the business lines of the Port Authority, and what the authority, what flexibility the authority has relative to those business lines, and what the financing models are into the future and things like that. Sounds like I think I agree with you in terms of air travel, perhaps not business travel, but personal travel and things like that. So maybe the airport lines and the investments happening now in state of good repair and modernizing the airports is obviously going to continue and is a good investment. What do you think the changes that we're talking about in terms of a fundamental reset in office and commutation, how might that impact the Port Authority's business lines and financing approaches, things like that?
Well, I wish Rick Cotton were back on with us at the moment, because he would have all the statistics. But from everything I hear on the traffic news and when I listen to the radio in the morning, the bridges and tunnels are filled, and they're filled in the evening going out, just they are coming in and out of Brooklyn, etc. So, and once Broadway opens, and that whole activity, that's going to mean a lot of suburban folks coming back in to visit the city, and get the next big regional mall open, the city people will find their way to the suburbs. So I think the Port Authority is going to do very well. I can't comment directly about what will happen to the Port Authority's own office buildings, but there's going to be a demand, and that New York City will still emerge, I think, as one of the super cities, as Jim described them, internationally. And I'm more positive about business travel. It'll pick up.
Great.
I think one of the issues really in the office ecosystem is really aging infrastructure. I mean, it's replicating the problems we had with our road and tunnel infrastructure and our bus terminal infrastructure and the like. Much of that suburban low-rise ground scraper office space is now between 31 and 41 years of age. And a lot of it wasn't very good to begin with. On the other hand, within Manhattan, the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building are now 91 years of age. They've been updated, but you also have a big office inventory that is potentially obsolete. So we see a lot of replacement space being built. That's what Hudson Yards is. It's basically not net new tenants into the city. It's tenants moving from older office buildings into newer, more efficient ones. And the same cluster around Grand Central Terminal is occurring. You have a lot of obsolete space on Park Avenue and Madison Avenue, and it's being essentially, the replacements are being built. So I think we're going to have potential reuse a lot of that obsolete space, both in the city and the suburbs and the like. So it is another dimension of a transformation that was probably overdue, but COVID-19 again has been the gasoline on the fire accelerant.
Great, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Rosemary. We do have one question from the audience here that's come in, and I think it's probably for Rosemary, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer it, but we'll try. Somebody observed that the Port Authority as an agency did a significant amount, invested a lot in planning work related to the waterfront areas and waterfront development, and then there's a question as to whether they've been kind of pushed out of the revenue side of that, and I wonder if you might be able to reflect on that observation.
I couldn't comment on the revenue side because I don't know, I've never seen any numbers coming in from the Hoboken, but it obviously was successful, because when everything that was built right? And around the wonderful Frank Sinatra Park, everything filled up in those new buildings and the new houses, the housing projects. And all you have to do is just drive down the FDR highway in New York City and look at the Queens waterfront, right? We kickstarted that, the Port Authority teams. We did that. You know, the city took over and then the private sector took over. So it clearly has been a major contributor to the regional economy. And only the Port Authority would know about the revenue stream.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rosemary. And that brings us to the close of our first session. Thank you both very, very much for your insightful talks. We really appreciate it. We got a lot of positive feedback in the Q&A, not in the form of Q&A, but in the form of kudos to both of you. So we thank you for that. And we're going to, at this point, sort of take a little bit of a break, transition to make sure our panelists are all in place for session number 2, which will start in about 15 minutes. So if you're an attendee, this would be time to take a quick break, get yourself some afternoon snack, or take care of any other business you might have. And we'll be back at 2:30 to start our second session. So thank you very much. And Rosemary and Jim, if you're going to be leaving us, then thank you again for participating, and we hope you have a great afternoon. All right, it is 2:30, and we're going to reconvene for our second session. This session will be a set of panel presentations on 3 important projects from the region, and a discussion of the Port Authority's role in helping to steward the region's economy, thinking big and solving problems. We hope to illustrate those themes through a series of talks on these 3 projects. And Ann Strauss-Weeder, who is the Director of Freight Planning at the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, will be the moderator for the session. She's going to provide some sort of opening framing remarks before we get started with each of the 3 presentations. Ann?
Thank you, John. If you can go to the next slide, please. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor to moderate this distinguished panel today. And it's hard to believe that we're talking about the 100th anniversary of the Port Authority's founding. Jim has done, as he has always done, a remarkable job of showing the changing economic context for our region. And Rosemary has articulated everything that's happened at the Port Authority, not during the last 100 years, but certainly during her time there, bringing back great fond memories of all the accomplishments of the agency. So I'm going to set the stage now by looking at some of the region's innovations, some of the challenges, and some of the ways that we have worked together in terms of solving issues and taking those big picture views of how to move forward. So with that, if you can go to the next slide. I'm going to go back beyond the 100 years of the formation of the Port Authority. And for that matter, I'm a freight professional, so I'm going to look back from a freight perspective all the way back to 1792 and Alexander Hamilton, who looked at the new nation and realized that we needed a good industrial base. So he founded the Society for Useful Manufacturing and established the first industrial park on 800 acres in Paterson, New Jersey. So when you go to the Great Falls, you will see a statue of Alexander Hamilton, who was the creator of the first industrial park, not only within our region, but across the country. Our region was also early implementers of road systems and railroad systems, And then moving up to April 1956, we were the birthplace of containerization with the Ideal X, the box that changed the world. So our region has a very rich history of innovation. And if we go to the next slide, see where we are today from a freight perspective and an economic engine viewpoint. We have the largest port on the East Coast in terms of container activity, with even more happening this year. As a small state, we have a very large industrial footprint with well over 1 billion square feet in New Jersey alone of industrial property. And in the northern and central part of the state, over 851 million square feet, with over 140 buildings added since the end of 2016. We started with road and rail, and we've built up robust systems. However, that also means that we have legacy infrastructure that we're trying to adapt to 21st century needs. So we have accomplished a lot. We have worked together to do it, and we've shown a lot of innovation. Next slide. And as has been pointed out, we have been a region that has been challenged in so many ways. 20 years ago in September, so many of us lost friends and colleagues in the destruction of the World Trade Center. But both the region and the Port Authority did not go quietly into the night. There are many reports of the heroic efforts made to evacuate people, to rebuild, to think big, and to go beyond where we were, to really show the world we are here and we're still that star city that Jim mentioned. And we will hear from Lynn today about the Oculus, part of that rebirth. Next slide. And just about 10 years ago, we weathered Superstorm Sandy. It flooded the Trans-Hudson tunnels. It flooded major transit facilities, the PATH system. It disrupted the port. It closed the Port of New York and New Jersey during the peak of the peak shipping season. Yet, if we go to the next slide, we emerged even stronger. We got the system back up and running. We moved ahead. In terms of bringing that port back online, as John will be talking about, 5 days it took to bring that port back online with labor and owners working together, the public sector, the private sector, every aspect of the system getting together and saying, we will get this done. And similarly, we'll hear from Martin, because I remember when Martin started the Access to the Region's Core project so many years ago, but he and others never gave up. And we are now seeing the construction, hopefully very soon, of the 2 new tunnels and addressing the damage that was done through Superstorm Sandy. And if we go to the next slide. And right now, as Jim mentioned also, we've been pivoting in a global pandemic. It hit worldwide, but in terms of our region, it hit us here first in North America, and it hit us hard. We can talk about the terrible losses, but we can also talk about how the communities rallied together to help each other, and how the transportation systems have had to pivot in very unusual times. And I have a slide up here, but what's happening at the port, where it was recognized that there were going to be canceled sailings because production overseas was shut down as COVID ran through it. And then as those production facilities came back online, and that's the blue line on the slide, the cargo started surging through the port at levels we had never seen before. And again, everyone rallied. The supply chain system was really challenged to get the goods flowing and to welcome ever-growing vessels. And then that red ragged line is how 2021 is shaped up so far. Last year, it may have been toilet paper that everyone was seeking. But right now, if you're looking for a car or seeking a sofa, or I'm even told there's a shortage of bathtubs right now, it's because production is gradually coming online and the freight system is trying to handle those incredible surges in volumes. Through it all, it should be noted, we've talked about 9/11, Superstorm Sandy, and now the pandemic. No one has gone hungry. Businesses have been affected, as Jim has articulated, but every effort has been made to work together and emerge stronger. If we go to the next slide. 3 C's to remember as we've gone through this and as we pivot towards the future: collaboration, coordination, and communication. We've innovated, we've survived challenges, and we've prospered because we have worked together. The Port Authority has done a lot and has done it in collaboration with others. And through that collaboration and coordination and communication, whether we're talking the Council on Port Performance or the Gateway Program or others, we've been able to solve issues proactively, collaboratively, and innovatively. We've been able to communicate, not just to inform, but to really listen and engage. And very importantly, to pivot in this amazing evolving context to figure out the future and work together to really think big. So it is my pleasure to introduce Martin, followed by Lynn, and then by John. And then I'm going to ask that you pose questions in the Q&A while they're all talking. And then we'll come back at the end for a conversation. So Martin, the virtual floor is yours.
Very good. I want to thank, let me say this, that this is a very distinguished panel and a very distinguished program. And I'm very proud to be part of it. And I want to specifically thank John Carnegie for his exquisite timing in scheduling my talk on this panel. Just a few months ago, the Hudson River Tunnel project was being strangled by the Trump administration. Then just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration issued the much, much belated approval of the tunnel project's final environmental impact statement and record of decision. This breakthrough event provides us with a real opportunity to reassess how the Port Authority's role in the Hudson River Tunnel project might evolve, as well as how that evolution might influence other roles confronting the Port Authority on future regional projects. So instead of a depressing elegy about the useful but futile role of the Port Authority in launching and sustaining the vital Hudson River Tunnel project, we can look forward to and contemplate steps that may be taken by the Port Authority and other agencies to restore the Gateway program's momentum. Those steps are likely to be quickened as passage of President Biden's massive infrastructure proposal provides an initial funding boost. Now, what is the Gateway program as it stands today? The Gateway program is a collection of multi-billion-dollar regional rail projects that are designed to expand and improve rail transit access between northern New Jersey and Midtown Manhattan, specifically into the Penn Station, New York complex. It focuses on a 10-mile segment of the Northeast Corridor that is owned by Amtrak and is heavily used. A front-end element is construction of a new high-level bridge over the Hackensack River to replace the Portal Bridge, a long outmoded swing bridge that frequently malfunctions, disrupting rail passenger service over this densely used segment of the Northeast Corridor. The centerpiece of the Gateway program is a pair of new rail tunnels to supplement the existing pair of tubes that were constructed more than 100 years ago by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and as Ann just mentioned, were seriously damaged 9 years ago by the flooding of Superstorm Sandy. The thorough renovation of those tubes for reuse is another integral element of the Gateway program. A key question is which agency should be responsible for the Gateway program. The governmental landscape of transportation agencies in the bi-state region does not present an easy fit selection of a lead agency for oversight and execution of this specific mammoth undertaking. No existing agency is a perfect fit. Amtrak is the owner of the facility, then a minority user. New Jersey Transit is a majority user, but only a tenant. MTA has a limited role in the 10-mile segment. And the Port Authority has limited connections to the 10-mile segment, but has a regional focus and institutional and financial strength. So where do we go? One other thing to consider, to add urgency to this, is that the severe damage inflicted by Superstorm Sandy to the interior of the existing tubes, especially in traction power and signals, created heightened unease about the reliability of those facilities for the medium term. Luckily for this region, there was an immediate response toward the end of the Obama administration. And it was led by Senator Chuck Schumer and Senator Cory Booker. They recognized that the institutional and financial solutions had to be found to carry out the Gateway program. Senators pressed for provisional commitments to the funding of the Gateway program and collaborated in shaping a new entity, the Gateway Development Corporation, or Commission, to provide oversight and execution of the program. In that exercise, they looked beyond the fact that the Port Authority was the sole entity with an established mission to deal with bi-state transportation issues. They sought instead a less cumbersome, more customized solution. However, they still needed certain strengths of the Port Authority. So they set up the corporation or commission administratively as a special purpose entity under the Port Authority, facilitating work by it's working by lending staff, offering space, and providing logistics to the new corporation. The Gateway program would be funded 50% by the states of New Jersey and New York, based on a September 15, 2015 letter from Governors Cuomo and Christie, and the other half was to be funded by the federal government. All this sounds like a great path we thought we were going to be following. The corporation was set up with 3 commissioners from each New Jersey and New York, and 1 from the Amtrak Board of Directors. It originally had a US DOT representative as well. Primary dedicated staff for the corporation would be provided by the Port Authority and Amtrak. Faithfully, the commission held its first meeting on January 12th, 2017, just a week and a half before the advent of the Trump administration. Then it began running into numerous crippling hammer blows imposed by the federal government. First, the US DOT was withdrawn from the board. Next, the project's rating against competitive transit projects, disallowance of loans to the states as eligible contributions toward local share, and withdrawal of all federal funding commitments followed. Thus, because the Gateway program was largely stymied during the Trump years, the efficacy of the Gateway Development Commission has not yet been tested. The Development Commission leadership called upon US DOT to issue the Hudson River Tunnel record of decision as long ago as January 2019, 9 months after the US DOT's self-imposed deadline. Now that the Gateway program has had its political momentum finally restored, the region will learn from experience whether the Gateway Development Corporation Commission, this untested, customized institution, is up to this challenging task. Many challenges are ahead and questions are to be resolved. These include determining the scope, timing, and price of the Gateway program. The documents that have so far been submitted peg the cost of those projects at $11.6 billion, but that's only part of the project. How much will the Gateway project benefit from the Biden infrastructure bill? Still to be known. How else will the Gateway program's provisional financial plan be modified from that agreed to with the Obama administration, remembering that the Trump administration tossed it in the garbage can? How might political instability in New York State cause changes in that state's previous commitments? And to what extent will the project maintain its political support despite pandemic-caused ridership losses that no doubt will have continuing effect on both the operations of the systems that would benefit from this project and also from public support being challenged? And to what extent will the Port Authority experience mission creep as people will tend to look to this fabled agency of great competence to see if it can somehow help ever more? These issues should provide the people who are watching on Zoom with plenty of food for thought about how this project affects the Port Authority now, and does it provide a formula for how the Port Authority will deal with regional projects in the future? To be determined. Thank you very much.
Lynn, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say at the outset how much I appreciate this opportunity to honor the Port Authority's centennial. Unlike other projects discussed this afternoon, rebuilding the World Trade Center was a project born of tragic circumstance. And unlike the Port Authority's original development of the World Trade Center, the reconstruction of the site after the terrorist attack on 9/11 did not follow the pattern of unilateral decision-making the Port Authority was able to exercise in the 1960s. Decisions about how to reconstruct the site, a site that now many considered sacred, were, on the contrary, governed by a dual mandate to both remember and rebuild. In my time this afternoon, I will focus on how this dual mandate impacted the development of the Oculus Transportation Hub. This is a big story within a bigger story, so I can only hit on the most significant aspects, and especially those aspects of the Port Authority's engagement with rebuilding that are not well known. Next slide, please. Next slide. The tragedy of 9/11 and the destruction of the World Trade Center created a rare opportunity for New York City to rethink its long-term economic needs in Lower Manhattan. This opportunity carried with it an unquestionable priority, everlasting remembrance of those who died on that fateful day. September 11th transformed the human meaning of the World Trade Center site because it was now a graveyard for nearly 3,000 souls. And that meant that every piece of what would become the new World Trade Center would be infused with symbolic significance and debated with emotional intensity. This was no less true for the Port Authority's transportation hub than it was for the memorial and the commercial towers we see on the site today. Accommodating the twin mandates defined competing claims on the site, memorializing the fallen while rebuilding the commercial engine of Lower Manhattan. In the earliest days after 9/11, it became immediately clear, though it was not explicitly stated as such, that the terrorist attack created a compelling public interest, and that public interest would displace prevailing property rights of both the Port Authority as landowner and Larry Silverstein and his investment partnership as owners of a 99-year lease on the site executed just 6 weeks prior. Ultimately, the property rights of both stakeholders had to be amended. The Port Authority and Silverstein relinquished development rights on the Memorial Quadrant, and responsibility for the development of the commercial office space was realigned. The Port Authority took on the development of the iconic One World Trade Center and a second tower and the retail facilities, while Silverstein took responsibility for the 3 additional office towers. Going forward, this meant that redevelopment would proceed under divided control, and inevitably, because their interests were not fully aligned, controversy. Next slide, please. When in June 2002, Governor Pataki unexpectedly announced that nothing would be built on the footprints of the Twin Towers, his statement made explicit what many assumed would be the case, and it essentially determined the site plan that you see here shown in the slide. Remembrance would occupy 1/2 of the 16-acre site. Of the remaining space, the location of the hub was set by the underground path and subway connections, leaving the office towers to surround the site in an L-shaped fashion. Next slide, please. Amid the contention of how to replan the site, senior staff at the Port Authority wanted to get in the lead with some aspect of rebuilding, and the train hall would be the one project that would indisputably belong to the Port Authority. Staff believed that the agency had to make a statement of architectural grandeur, hence the hire of the internationally known Santiago Calatrava. Such a treatment would assure the Port Authority's legacy as owner and developer of the original World Trade Center, and most importantly, at the same time, function as a memorial to its 9/11 fallen employees. Executive Director Neil Levin, 37 of its 55-person police command, and 46 of its operations staff. Rebuilding the Trade Center Path Station destroyed on 9/11 also created an important opportunity to rationalize the spaghetti maze of 12 transit connections in Lower Manhattan. With an allocation of $2 billion in federal funds, the hub became the unchallenged priority of the agency and a means to refurbish its legacy of engineering prowess. Next slide. The PA was also in charge of a critical, unnoticed starting point of the task of rebuilding, configuring a new underground, which had to be accomplished before construction could start on any other part of the rebuild: the memorial, the 5 commercial towers, the security control center. As owner of the site, the agency took control of planning and rebuilding the complex underground infrastructure. This was a unilateral decision that would replicate the centralized control of the original World Trade Center. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The design of the underground had any number of implications for every piece of the program that would be built above, as evidenced by this complex schematic view of the multi-level underground that would service the entire complex. The hub became the linchpin of the Underground Superblock, the only project connecting to all the other parts of the Trade Center's rebuilding program and all the other stakeholders on the site, as shown in the image on this right side of the slide. Building it was akin to working pieces in a gigantic multi-dimensional puzzle, and it really challenged and showed the skill of the Port Authority engineers. Next slide, please. Building the underground was an extremely complex project. Though we do not have time to discuss this, let me just say that the Port Authority had to contend with any number of demanding engineering and management challenges. First, because Governor Pataki insisted that the #1 subway line could not be temporarily shut down during reconstruction. And second, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Because of Calatrava's exacting aesthetic demands, as epitomized by the massive and expensive truss required to meet the architect's vision for a grand entrance to the path mezzanine. Next slide. In rebuilding the underground and transportation hub, the Port Authority was not working with a blank slate as in 1960s, but rather on a site packed with emotional content and physical remnants whose historic consequences had to be considered in the plans, processes, and designs for the rebuilding projects, especially the hub. This greatly complicated the politics and engineering of its construction. In the absence of standing buildings, preservation advocates wanted not just to salvage and preserve Trade Center artifacts that you see here being stored in the Hangar 17 at JFK, they wanted to make a visible memory. They wanted to make the artifacts a talisman of the rebuilt center. These fragments had to stand in for the memory of what was before and what happened on 9/11. Next slide, please. A consensus quickly evolved about the importance of two highly symbolic artifacts: the slurry wall that kept back the waters of the Hudson as a symbol of survival and resilience, and the footprints of the Twin Towers as a sacred graveyard for the 3,000 who lost their lives that day. But there were other heavily symbolic artifacts of destruction, in particular the box beam column remnants of the Twin Towers and the Vesey Street staircase by which so many escaped the attack. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Resolving whether and how to incorporate these artifacts in the plans involved much discussion and controversy. In time, the Port Authority worked hard, very hard, at doing the right thing, taking pains to accommodate history. A typical response, as I was told by one of my interviewees, was, "We can't do this," PA staff would say. "We can't save these elements. It's not feasible because of construction." At the next meeting, they would come back and say they had figured out a way. They problem solved the problem. None of these discussions, however, ran smoothly, but they all became successful outcomes. Next slide, please. The image of this slide that's coming up next shows how both symbolic artifacts, the box beam columns, were incorporated into the museum, in the Memorial Museum. And next slide, please. And this shows the survivor staircase incorporated into the Memorial Museum as well. For its conscientious and careful execution, the National Trust for Historic Preservation awarded the Port Authority and the Federal Transit Administration its award for federal partnership in historic preservation, citing, and I quote, "exhaustive and sometimes contentious process of negotiation, collaboration, and innovation involved in preserving these artifacts, especially the survivor's staircase," unquote. Next slide, please. The project's complexity, multiple execution problems, constant delays, and ballooning cost overruns on every aspect of the project made for constant negative press coverage of the rebuilding crisis, which was always a crisis in the press's words, at ground zero, and also of the Port Authority. I am telescoping a difficult and contentious period of years when I say, after several external and internal project assessments by outside construction management experts, as well as agency staff, there was an eventual construction reset and assertion, most importantly, of the agency's control over Calatrava, and visible project progress, as you can see, demarked by the construction cranes in the bottom of that slide. Next slide, please. A last important role the Port Authority played, and one that's not very well known in the rebuilding process, was assuring the opening of the 9/11 Memorial on the 10th anniversary. This was not so easily achieved. It called for innovation in construction sequencing to, as the Port Authority staff would say, build the roof first. Please go back to the other slide. so that this quadrant, which you see full of trees, and the schematic of that quadrant would be in place at the 10th anniversary, completed in time. Next slide. On March 4th, 2016, the Oculus finally opened to much acclaim and much criticism at the time. Almost everything in New York gets criticism before it gets its final lasting acclaim. Next slide, please. There are several takeaways that I want to mention in conclusion here. And one is that big, ambitious projects like the rebuild of the Trade Center site take a long time to complete when political power is dispersed, as was the case at Ground Zero. Second, it's often misunderstood how important a role symbolic politics plays in high-profile projects of city building, as definitely was the case at the Trade Center. Third, public-private projects are full of pitfalls. It's naive to expect that they will go smoothly, but it's especially true when demand is uncertain, as it was at Ground Zero. Nobody knew how much office space would be demanded. They just knew that the Port Authority and Silverstein and the governor wanted to rebuild all 10 million square feet of office space. It's also difficult when there's little accountability for costs. And last, I would say the enormous costs of inspiring projects like the Oculus Transportation Hub will inevitably be forgotten over time, no matter how contentious the cost battle was during the process of rebuilding. But what future generations of New York residents inherit becomes a lasting and beautiful monument of civic space as we have today. Thank you very much. The last slide says I'm thanking you. This was really wonderful to participate in this panel. Thank you. And John, you're up next.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. All right. Thanks, Ann. Thank you, Lynn. And thank you to the Port Authority for asking New York Shipping to present this revolutionary project. I'm going to give an ocean carrier's perspective on raising the Bayonne Bridge, and then to get into some of the economic impacts and the technical issues around this incredible project. So go to the next slide, please. So as you can see here, the original bridge was built in 1931. Ships were a little smaller back then than ships today. In fact, they're 20 times smaller than ships today. And most of the commerce back then happened on the New York side of the harbor with finger piers in Manhattan and Brooklyn. And I'm sure nobody was thinking about 80 years later. The American Institute for Steel Construction selected the Bayonne Bridge at the time as the most beautiful steel bridge in 1931, choosing it over the George Washington Bridge for that status. So it was quite the landmark. The bridge actually became a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark in 1985, which was great news for the bridge and its designers, but bad news for anybody who was looking to tear it down and build another one. So how big of a problem was the Bayonne Bridge for the shipping world? Well, prior to it being raised in 2017, the Bayonne Bridge was the limiting factor for all major ports for air draft, which is how high they are above the water, or how high a vessel could be built. Think about that. There was the limiting factor worldwide for all major ports, right? And it didn't just limit the size of the vessels calling New York and New Jersey, because it didn't make sense for ocean carriers to put vessels into a service on the US East Coast because they needed to call New York and New Jersey because we have 23 million local consumers and up to 100 million consumers within 36 hours. So other ports were suffering as well. The whole East Coast was. And if you don't think the bridge was a hazard to land and sea, I know of at least 3 vessels which came in contact with the bridge. I'm sure there were more, and came in contact with is a nice way of saying they hit the bridge. It happens. Ships were getting bigger, limits are being pushed, calculations could be wrong, and a variety of other issues. Okay, but before we get into all that, in my mind, there were 2 other projects that were directly connected to raising the bridge that I'm going to briefly touch upon to give you the full scope of the project, and the third evolutionary factor that I'll address after that. The 2 projects that I want to talk about just for a few minutes are the Harbour Deepening project and the expansion of the Panama Canal. When I go through these projects, keep in mind, no other port had a Bayonne Bridge obstacle on the East Coast or around the world. Several other competing ports already had deeper channels. So first I'm going to talk about the 50-foot harbor dredging project. It was to deepen 38 miles of channels to 50 feet to allow larger vessels to access the Elizabeth and Newark Marine Complex. And that project actually started in 1989 with a 40-foot project. And people had the vision back then to say, why stop there? We need to push to 50 feet. The authorization or allocation of funds to go to 50 feet was granted in 2004, and the final dredging was completed in 2016. But think about the vision of the people back in 1989 who ran the Port Authority, people in Congress, the Army Corps, the stakeholders, and organizations such as NYSA to look further down the road and say, we're going to need to do that. It was 28 years prior to the CMA Theodore Roosevelt, a container ship that can carry 14,000 20-foot containers with a length of 1,200 feet to pass under the bridge. So our forefathers had a lot of vision. Let's talk a little bit about the Panama Canal. So if you can flip to the next chart, please. So as you can see here, showing the different trade lanes that come in and out of the Port of New York and New Jersey, you can see the importance of the Panama Canal connecting the US East Coast to Asia, especially North Asia and China. And even the West Coast of South America, where you're getting all your fruits and vegetables from the last 3-4 months. Smart people run the canal. In the early 2000s, they saw what was happening with the size of vessels. And long-term, they were in danger of being marginalized by rail competition via the US West Coast, and also by the Suez Canal, which can handle vessels 4 times the size of the Panama Canal at the time. The canal was the largest source of revenue to Panama, but the cost to expand the canal was huge. Because of the huge risk-reward scenario, in 2006, the question of expanding the canal was put forward in a national referendum to the people of Panama. Fortunately, the country voted in favor of expanding the canal in 2016, and the canal has been expanded to handle vessels that can handle 12,500 20-foot containers. Prior to that, the largest vessel could only carry 4,800 containers. So we have the deep water, and we have a Panama Canal that can handle 12,500 TEUs, but still there's no way that they could fit under the Bayonne Bridge. Can you flip the chart, please? There's another factor connected to the need to raise the Bayonne Bridge. The migration in the Port of New York and New Jersey of cargo handling facilities to the Newark and Elizabeth Marine Complex. Back in the 50s and 60s, most of the cargo handling activity took place in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and the land became more valuable for other purposes. And when containerization kicked in, the operation shifted to New Jersey. You can see in this chart where the lion's share of terminal capacity lies, which is Newark and Elizabeth. And you could also see that red circle in the middle there, which is blocking the Verrazano Narrows in the harbor from getting to those facilities. Currently, 85% container capacity in the port is on the other side of the Bayonne Bridge. And there was no way the port could grow without connecting the larger vessels with Newark and Elizabeth. Why does the port need to grow? Well, do you want your cargo? Do you like your lifestyle? I'm pretty certain that the computer screen you're all looking at came via vessel, as well as the chair you're sitting in, and probably the desk you're leaning on, and probably most everything else in your home or what you're wearing. But more importantly, the port is the fuel that drives the economic engine of the local economy. Every couple of years, New York Shipping Association, along with ANN and NJTPA, calculate the economic impact of the port industry in our region. In 2016, before the bridge was raised, the port accounted for 400,000 jobs. 3 years later, after the bridge was raised, it was in 2017, the jobs that we counted topped 500,000. 100,000 jobs growth in 2 years since the bridge went up. More jobs means more personal income and more tax revenue on both the federal and state level. And if anybody wants to see that study, it's on our website at nysanet.org. Please flip to the next chart, please. So here's a picture of the original bridge, the national landmark, and it's 151-foot air draft above the water. Looks pretty high, but not high enough. I was asked back then, well, how high should we make the bridge? And my response was, why don't you make it the same height as the Verrazano? Because then you'll never need to make it higher unless you're going to replace the Verrazano. So please flip the chart. So here's a little touching on the evolution of container ship sizes in the world, showing how uncompetitive the port was becoming. The largest ships that could get under the bridge with certainty were Panamax vessels, which were being built around 1985. Some of the smaller post-Panamax vessels, which you can see here are in the 6,000 to 8,000 TEU range, could fit in under certain circumstances, but certainly not the larger vessels, not the 12,000s, not the 10,000s, and certainly not the 14,000. From a competitive perspective, all other major East Coast and West Coast ports really could handle these ships, and the port was competitively on the outside looking in. Next chart, please. So now we get to the meat of the presentation, which is raising the roadway on the Bayonne Bridge. What you won't see in photos is the joint effort of the stakeholders of the port that we put together to make this happen. The Port Authority, the New York Shipping Association, the International Longshoremen's Association, local leaders, state representatives in Washington, D.C., all worked hand in hand to convince officials of the importance of this project. The problem with a project like this is that generally the public is, in my opinion, generally the public is oblivious when it comes to the port. Most people rarely ever ask themselves, I wonder how this furniture got to my house from Asia. It just kind of shows up. So back then, NYSA embarked on a public relations media campaign to raise awareness. We were on the radio during morning drive. We posted billboards up and down the turnpike, and the stakeholders lobbied hard to make this happen. And it did happen. And you can see the picture here of the bridge, the original roadway on the bottom, and the raising the roadway above. And it was not complete there, but you can see that there was just a piece in the middle that needed to be completed. In 2009, when we pushed ahead, there was an environmental review done by the Coast Guard. It was commissioned. The review was required because the project would take place over a navigable waterway. The study cost over $2 million, which is not a lot of money for such a study, but it took 4 years and resulted in 5,000 pages of reviews. And despite its duration and cost, which precluded the start of the construction until 2013, it was one of the Coast Guard's quickest environmental reviews for such a major project. In March 2012, the Port Authority submitted a request to the federal government for an expedited environmental review, which was approved in July of 2012, even though some residents in Bayonne, Newark, and Staten Island said they wanted the Coast Guard to do an even more thorough environmental review. By 2013, construction started on the project known as Bayonne Bridge Navigational Clearance Project. The design called for raising the roadbed 64 feet to, like I said before, a height of 215 feet over the waterway, followed by the demolition of the original roadbed. The estimated cost was $1.7 billion. Because of the historical significance of the bridge, a decision was made to strengthen the arch and raise the roadway. The decision resulted in an extremely complex engineering masterpiece. You couldn't just tear it down and build another one. You needed the connection between New York and New Jersey for vehicles, and the channel needed to stay open. And if you're going to tear it down and build another one, you would have to close for both. More than 4,000 tons of steel plate were used to strengthen the bridge, and to maintain a 100-year design life, stainless rebar was used in the superstructure. With carefully planned stage conduction, the bridge remained open to traffic during peak hours, with closures usually limited to weekends and nights, and the channel remained open throughout construction. Following completion of the higher roadbed, the original roadbed was demolished, clearing the way for larger ships to pass beneath the Bayonne Bridge. Next slide, please. So here's the picture of the Bayonne Bridge as when the roadway was cleared and the 215-foot air draft was enabled. And I'm sure today the Port Authority will tell you that our efforts are already paying off. Record cargo volumes are coming in and out of the port each year. After decades of effort, we've solidified our port as an engine for economic growth and jobs for the region and the nation. I personally can't do justice explaining the engineering marvel that this project was, but here's what experts in the engineering world had to say. The navigational clearance milestone for raising the Bayonne Bridge has been honored as the best overall engineering achievement in 2017 by the American Council of Engineering Companies, ACEC. And the project received the Grand Conceptor Award at the ACEC's Engineering Excellence Award Gala in Washington, D.C. in April 2017. The project was selected by a panel of nearly 30 judges as 2017's most outstanding engineering accomplishment from a group of 160 finalists. Next picture, next slide, please. So here's a photo of the Theodore Roosevelt belt as it passed under the Bayonne Bridge September 7th, 2017. At this single point in time, 4 projects, 30 plus years in the making: the Harbour deepening, the Panama Canal expansion, the shifting of cargo handling into the Newark and Elizabeth complex, and finally raising of the Bayonne Bridge, all came together at one point when this ship went under that bridge. It's a marvel from an engineering perspective, and it's a marvel from a stakeholder perspective of what can be done in the Port of New York, New Jersey, when we work together to solve our challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, Lynn, and John. Could all 3 of you come back visually on screen? And I'm going to ask the audience to continue to post questions in the Q&A box. But we'll start with Martin. What does the Gateway program history suggest about future requests the Port Authority might receive concerning future regional transportation projects?
I think the message that I derive from the research here is that the Port Authority is a very strong institution, and that it has the ability to provide logistical support, financial support, space support that many other agencies do not have. So it can become available even on issues that don't directly affect the Port Authority. And the Gateway is on the fringe of directly affecting the Port Authority. But what the Port Authority can do is stand ready to provide the facilitation of the institutions that can carry out these projects. I think it's a very interesting model.
Thank you, Martin. Over to you, Lynn. Why did rebuilding, as the critics said over and over, take so long?
Well, first of all, I would say the critics were wrong. The typical period of time for a large-scale project to be rebuilt in New York City is 25 years. The Port Authority, when my book came out on the 15th anniversary, the Port Authority and Silverstein and the other entities involved had rebuilt almost 80% of the site in 15 years. Given the controversy and the conflict and the complexity of this project, that was really an astounding achievement. And they had the memorial open on the 10th anniversary. One of the reasons the critics kept saying, why is it taking so long? Well, there are really 2 reasons, I think. One is just the natural human response of wanting it done to heal. It was such a tragic and wrenching experience that people wanted the replacement as soon as possible. And second, I think you have to lay some of that expectation, unrealistic expectation, on the governor's constant promotion that the site would be rebuilt in 5 years, which was totally unrealistic, but it was a political goal that he had in mind, and it did shape expectations. But I think it was amazing achievement in what they got done in 15 years. And now the Performing Arts Center is under construction. There is a program for the 5th tower, and eventually the Silverstein's 3rd office tower will probably come into being in the next cycle, which whenever that starts.
Thank you, Lynn. John, you heard me mention that tremendous volume of cargo now coming through the port. And people are, clearly spending on goods when they couldn't travel. And if you can give us some idea, these are volumes that weren't anticipated to occur to about 2026. Now, how's the port coping with this volume and future growth?
Yeah, thanks, Ann. That's a great question. And it's really a supply chain question. It's not just a port question. It's just that when any issue happens in the supply chain, the ports get backed up. So, we need to look at that answer from a supply chain perspective. Warehouses have been having difficulty lately. They're filled up with goods that they can't move out fast enough. They're having difficulty getting labor. There's trucking they have shortages of drivers. The means of conveyance to move the containers in and out of the terminals, there's shortages of. And there's only so many hours in a day that we have been working. But I think what we need to look at in the future is that the freight supply chain needs to change from what we are now at pretty much a 12-hour day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. to a 24-hour operation. There's 12 hours in the evening and at night where, most people are not using the roadways. And so when we say we're running out of capacity because, there isn't enough space, there's plenty of space. It's just that we need to change how we handle the supply chain in the future and shift a lot of the freight movements to off hours so that we don't, all compete for the same space in a small window of time.
Thank you, John. Marta, we have a question from Middlesex County in terms of how can local governments and regional partners support and contribute to the evolution of the Gateway program?
Well, I think that now that things are taking shape, I hope that there is an opportunity to create between the Gateway Development Corporation and the public communication as to what is going on and what is needed in order to be able to carry the program out. Well, we've all been operating under the cloak of the Trump administration and what it was doing to stop the project. Now what we need to do is pull the cloak away and open up a dialogue and make it a part of organizations like the Tri-State, the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority can provide a forum for what is going on in Gateway and make it a regular part of our transportation discussions.
Thank you. Lynn, a question from our audience about how much of the impetus driving the architecture came from Port Authority staff versus the governor or members of the board of the Port Authority?
Well, I think the way I would answer that question was the Port Authority, as I mentioned, wanted, a legacy building, architecturally significant project, just the way the George Washington Bridge was when they hired the architect for the bridge, decades ago. And so in hiring Calatrava, they hired somebody whose artistic and engineering talents they admired and respected deeply. And that kind of respect led them to allow Calatrava to make more of the decisions than would be typical in a client sponsor relationship. And it was problematic for the agency for a while, for many years, until they did the construction reset. So it's really hard to say. I mean, the design was Calatrava's. When you walk into the path mezzanine, you'll see columns, what we call Chris Ward columns, because Chris, in order to move the project forward, needed to deal with some of the aesthetic demands that Calatrava was making and insisted that the way we were going to get this built and built faster was to put those columns in. So, it was Calatrava's vision, and in the end, it was the Port Authorities and their consultants and contractors' ability to build an extraordinary structure. And I think the most extraordinary piece of the hub is the path mezzanine. Everybody focuses on the oculus, but that path mezzanine is just spectacular.
Thank you, Lynn. John, the port was operating during the pandemic, as was the whole supply chain, bringing goods to support communities and businesses. And a lot had to be done to make sure that the workers remained healthy, even though we did suffer some losses at the port. Can you talk about some of the extraordinary efforts and what had to be done to get the equipment needed, the PPE and everything else for the workers, and and what was going on in terms of their safety during the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. And yeah, it was a crazy time. The volume in the port plunged from April through, say, end of June, and started to come back a little bit in July, and then it just exploded from September onwards. But when this first came up, when COVID first started, people were pretty much told, go home, quarantine, stay there. But longshoremen and port workers, you go to work shoulder to shoulder and make sure the freight keeps moving. So there was a tremendous amount of anxiety in the workforce that, and especially in the beginning, because in the beginning, people thought when you got COVID, you automatically died. It's before we knew what we know today. And so we worked really closely with the International Longshoremen's Association. We and the Port Authority as well worked together, getting PPE to these workers, shipping it in from wherever it had to be brought in. Cost was no issue at the time. We did whatever we had to do to get the PPE. We changed the work processes in the port. We changed, we had social distancing in the offices. We did shift work instead of doing, people working shorter hours and close together. We changed how people share machines. Instead of three workers sharing two machines, we cut it back so that two workers would share one machine. So we increased the labor intensity by increasing the social distancing. When vaccines became available, the ILA worked, and NYSA worked with Trenton, and the governor's office was able to allocate us 500 vaccines to kickstart the vaccines for the port workers. We became eligible March 30th, and we administered those vaccines to people who wanted them. And we're kind of back to normal now. We're rolling back some of those measures that we put in place, but really the close cooperation and communication between management and labor is what made it all happen. Without, we never missed a beat during the pandemic.
And I think we all thank you for the hard work and the sacrifices to keep communities and businesses going so well during the pandemic. Martin, transit ridership has plummeted with the pandemic. Will the political support for the Gateway project still be maintained even with what's happening in transit?
Well, that is, in my mind, that's a $64 question, or maybe a $60 billion question. I think we had excellent analysis earlier in this program by Jim Hughes and Rosemary about the changing dynamics of work and location of work. And I think that we don't really know what is going to happen. I think that there is another point that was made is that we have an excellent infrastructure. We have a good infrastructure, even without the Gateway project, enough to draw people back into rail transportation, rail commutation to some significant degree. Question is really going to be, is the appeal, that style of living and traveling going to be sufficiently strong so that people are going to ultimately return to where we were before the pandemic in terms of usage? I think that my sense is that we've got such a good thing compared to other places in the country that there will be a snapback. It may not be immediate, but I think that we'll see steady improvement, and that as that steady improvement goes on and the project that I described before actually is pursued, I think that the support will be there when it needs to be.
Thank you, Martin. So as we're coming to a close on this panel, I have to ask each of you, and we'll start with John, then go to Martin, and finally go to Lynn. We've heard from Jim, we've heard from Rosemary, we've had some really great conversations so far, but what trend or issue most keeps you up at night regarding the future of the region, and for that matter, the role of the Port Authority as we move forward? So starting with John, then Martin, and then Lynn.
Yeah, coming back to what I said before, it's the supply chain and it's really finding people who are qualified and want to work in the transportation business. Where we have labor shortages on, you name the link in the supply chain, and I'll tell you where the labor shortage is, whether it's the warehouse or the truckers or the supply chain or at the ocean carriers. And, we have difficulty hiring longshoremen in the port because of structural issues that we have here. So for me, it's really how do we keep people interested in this piece of the business, which requires some work. So whether it's truck drivers, but what we've done working with the Port Authority through the Council on Port Performance, which is a stakeholder group, which includes all of those stakeholders that I just mentioned and many more. We've been working with local high schools and universities developing curriculum to get people to even know that there's a port there. I mean, there's communities that have lived around the port and they don't even know what happens there. So we've been very big on education and trying to get younger people interested in seeing this as a viable career for them moving forward. So hopefully that continues, because without it, we're all going to be in trouble to move the freight that we're going to need in the future.
Thank you, John. Martin?
Yes, I think that you can guess what my concern is, what does keep me up at night. My entire professional career was built around accepting the public transit solution and the way in which our society and economy was laid out, with peak hour travel and trains to support the movement. And it has suffered quite a jolt from the pandemic. And I just wish that enough of it survives so that we will be able to reach our best by being able to keep the Gateway project moving.
Thank you. Lynn?
Storm Sandy was devastating to Lower Manhattan, both as a district of the city, as an engine for the regional economy, and clearly for the World Trade Center project. I mean, the memorial and Memorial Museum suffered terrible damage. What concerns me is the impact of changing climate and climate change on the port. Remember, the Port Authority's the first word in its name is port, which means it is by the water, and its assets are more vulnerable to climate change and rising waters than other public institutions. So I hope going forward that we have an opportunity to hear how the port is thinking about this, because I'm sure they're thinking about it, but we just, it's not out there in the public for the reader concerned about these kind of issues.
One more round robin before we conclude. So each of you has described a specific project or effort. What is the one effective practice or lesson learned that you think the region and the Port Authority should take with them as they consider future efforts? And again, we'll start with John, Martin, and Lynn. You'll help us wrap up.
Okay, well, it comes down to communication and what we've seen. The Port of New York, New Jersey is very interesting from an ocean going perspective. Other ports, they operate the port, they run the port. They don't run the airports, they don't run the path, they don't run the World Trade Center, they just operate the port. Here, the Port Authority is much more diverse. So it's very important that the Port Authority continues to, reach out and work with the stakeholders to find solutions. And I think they've done a good job on that. And I know, the Bayonne Bridge project was a great example. Recovering from Sandy was a great example. And, even today, this past year or so, dealing with COVID, the work we've done, we would meet with the Port Authority at least once or twice a week through COVID and the stakeholders to talk about, what's going on your piece of the supply chain, what help do you need, what can we do to help improve it? And, we didn't have all the answers, but at least we knew what the issues were. So I think just, going forward, they need to include all the stakeholders in finding the solutions to our way forward.
Thank you. Martin.
And I think that what the Port Authority staff and leadership can take from the Gateway project is that the answer isn't necessarily that the Port Authority has to do everything. The Port Authority can contribute, and if it keeps its mind open and it is able to facilitate other people to think through these issues as well as the Port Authority, that you can come up with an outcome that takes advantage of the Port Authority's most important strengths, at the same time, perhaps shape something that is even better for the region than simply saying that the Port Authority should do it. So look back to what happened and thank Senator Schumer and Senator Booker for pioneering this effort and giving us another way.
For several decades after the failure of the Westway project, New York City, and I would say the region, was hesitant to think big, hesitant to take on big, complex projects because the thought of failure is a very difficult problem for the public sector in city building. But one of the things that's so impressive about the World Trade Center and also the Bayonne project, which I was thrilled to hear more about because I knew about it's the decision-making to put it in place, is that you have to think big. It's not the only way to build cities. We need small scale, micro stuff too, but big projects shape districts. And so the lesson I would suggest that we take away from it is that the Port Authority hasn't in the past, but it certainly shouldn't shy away from thinking big and dealing with complex projects. Yes, they take a long time. So you have to have a public relations strategy to deal with the contention, to deal with educating the public of what it's about. But New York wasn't built by thinking small. And I don't think the region will continue to grow and succeed if we don't continue to think big.
What a fabulous way to conclude our session. Thanks very much to John and Martin and Lynn. And I'm turning the program back over to John. Have a great day, people.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you from me as well to Lynn, Martin, and John. Great panel discussion, great answers in the Q&A afterwards. At this point, we are going to transition to the last part of our program, which is actually closing remarks. And we've asked Tom Wright, who is uniquely positioned to kind of reflect on both sides of the river in terms of the future and the role of the Port Authority. He is president and CEO of the Regional Plan Association. And he's going to reflect a little bit on what's been said today, but really kind of nod to the future in terms of what the future holds for the region and the Port Authority. Tom, please take it away.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here this afternoon. And those were some fabulous presentations. I'm very honored to be part of this program. Congrats to you and to everyone at Rutgers and Vorhees for doing this, and to all of the panelists and speakers. I've been taking notes furiously and thinking about this and rethinking things I thought I knew. I think to try and summarize a little bit of what we've talked about this afternoon and try to point towards the future. Of course, at RPA, we're 99 years old this year. So we look up to our big brothers at the Port Authority and congratulate them on their centennial. These two organizations, of course, there were many other things that were they both come out of this period of extraordinary innovation in the public sector. I think it kind of, in my mind, it goes back to the creation of Greater New York City on January 1st, 1898, which was very much driven by also thoughts about infrastructure and connecting the cities and the region together. The Port Authority is created after years of dialogue and discussion and even legal proceedings. In 1921, 12 years later, Robert Moses creates what becomes the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority eventually. And then in 1968, the MTA is created, kind of pulling that together with the New York City Transit Authority. And in my mind, I look at this period as an extraordinary time when, if there wasn't an institution in place to fix the problems that we were facing, the public and civic leaders said, well, then let's create the organization that we need to do it. You can see certain core elements to their thinking. And part of it, and from RPA, of course, I'll celebrate the fact that they were thinking and acting regionally, that they weren't limited by the geographic boundaries or the political boundaries that they had, but rather thought in terms of the whole sense of the challenge and the problem they were facing, and were willing to go outside standard boundaries to think about those issues and create and fashion responses to them. They certainly had a very sophisticated recognition of the importance of infrastructure investment in promoting broadly shared prosperity and economic growth. We would say now that their concept of prosperity was maybe too limited in terms of certain economic and even racial classes. And there's a legacy of racial injustice that we need to address. But they were thinking about investment and the public sector being utilized to try and further economic growth and to promote welfare for their communities. And then they also had this kind of self-financing model in place, and this understanding that they could create these new mechanisms that would generate the funding necessary to do what they were trying to do. I have to say, as John was speaking on the last panel about just how extraordinary they are, and even at the beginning of this, when Chairman O'Toole was saying that these are pretty extraordinary, I heard in the back of my voice, my friend, the great Ken Jackson. I've heard Ken say many times, to paraphrase him ineloquently, but he would say that if you find yourself, say, driving along the New Jersey Turnpike and think about you're on one of the largest tolled roads and facilities in the world. Over one shoulder, you look at the largest seaport on the Atlantic seaboard. Across the other, Newark Airport, which is part of the greatest air travel network in the United States. Just past that, you have the Northeast Corridor connecting the entire Boston to Washington corridor. Within that piece, just within a half mile, 3/4 of a mile of you, is probably the greatest concentration of infrastructure on the entire planet. And that is the legacy, a lot of that, of the Port Authority and these extraordinary institutions that were created. People have talked about elements of that and the incredible success that they've had, creating truck and automobile access across the Hudson River with the GW Bridge and the Lincoln Tunnel, running the airports. And I'll point out in 1947, RPA did a conference and workshop called Airports of Tomorrow, essentially siding with, if you've read your Robert Caro, RPA sided with the Port Authority in their struggle with Robert Moses over whether the city or the Port Authority would control the airports, and agreed that running them would make an enormous amount of sense. The bus terminals, we barely talked about the fact that the Port Authority bus terminal was moving some 350,000 trips in and out of Manhattan on a daily basis pre-COVID, and the Upper Manhattan terminal with some 20,000. And then I think Lynn, hearing Lynn talk about the World Trade Center redevelopment is just extraordinary. And to realize that the path system all by itself was moving close to 300,000 trips a day pre-COVID, which would have put it around the 6th or 7th largest transit system in the entire nation, about equal to the SEPTA system in Philadelphia. So the scale of ambition and operations of the Port Authority, and I think, again, it was John who said just previously, the diversity of it, which I think has become a real strength of it. I try to teach my students that a public authority, just to understand, it's very different from a public agency, and it has special powers that we gave to this Port Authority. It is self-financing with no annual appropriations from the city and the state. We'd like to see, I wish other public authorities in our region were able to hit that goal too. But the Port Authority really does, by being independent financially, it really is allowed to do certain things that just would be impossible for agencies. It's also off-budget financing. Actually, I learned much of this when I took Lindsay Gallen's course in grad school, but their debt does not count towards the general obligation bonds of New York or New Jersey. and the debt that they issue is preferred debt, triple tax exempt, and so they have, it's a very low cost of debt. So they have extraordinary financing capacity, and it doesn't count towards the limits of others of other levels of government. They don't pay property taxes. They are the public sector. This is why, as folks may know, Larry Silverstein and Silverstein Properties entered into a 99-year lease with the World Trade Center rather than owning it outright, because a lease was more valuable essentially to the Port Authority. They can supersede local zoning and land use controls, while the Port Authority has in recent years actually gone through local zoning in ULURP in New York for various projects. That was something that they did on a voluntary basis. And then finally, just to remind folks that we give these agencies the power of eminent domain, the ability to acquire private property against the wishes of the property owner, because we understand that what they are trying to do is so important. So those are just extraordinary powers that we've combined within this organization, and then given it a kind of extraordinary set of challenges to tackle. It's I think kind of looking forward then, when you think about this, the Port Authority has, I think it has thrived and succeeded over the last century by being innovative. And once every generation or so, it would kind of see the trends developing and decide, aha, we're going to get into a new field of business. The airports were not part of their original charter, but they saw that as a growing need and something that could benefit from the kinds of powers that they had in their perspective. And so they moved into that area. Of course, the development of the World Trade Center site was them trying to bring back Lower Manhattan. And then they acquire a subway system as part of it. It might not have all been as the result of a grand plan, but in a strategic way, over the course of 100 years, the Port Authority has continually been innovating and creatively addressing the challenges, whatever it was that the region was facing, to try and create broadly shared prosperity. So looking forward, I think there are a number of areas, I think, and some of the other speakers have talked about them, that are going to come up. The first I will say is that I think we're all going to have to look at these in 2021 and going forward after last summer and mass protests and other things. We've got to be looking through these issues specifically through an equity lens. We have to recognize that the communities around the seaport suffer from worse air quality, that there are still transit deserts, even say close to Newark Airport in the Dayton neighborhood in the South Ward, that we have to do, that the Port Authority, just like every public sector entity and agency today, has to really take a hard look at its own history. And I want to say clearly at RPA, we're doing this ourselves as we think about the work that we were doing in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in terms of single family zoning across the region. I think all of us would benefit from taking a hard look in the mirror, understanding our own contributions towards society, and then thinking proactively about how we can address social and racial equity moving forward. And so that's one that I think the Port Authority is going to have to be thinking about. It's going to continue modernizing the airports. This has been a big ticket item. There's been enormous success with LaGuardia. Newark Airport is moving forward. Kennedy will. But we're going to, I think that that's going to be a real challenge, especially in the kind of fiscal constraints that they're going to have going forward, and continuing to move forward with that. Specifically, I think providing transit links to the airports, which is not easy, but is something that the Port Authority has really prioritized and is something that ought to move forward. And then things like, I think it was Lynn who just in the last panel talked about the challenges of climate change, because like you look at Teterboro Airport, which is a small airport, but provides a very important role within the overall system. And it's built in the meadowlands on wetlands. And we know what's going to happen with sea level rise to it. And so the Port Authority, not just at Teterboro, but in a lot of places, it's going to be faced with a challenge of dealing with climate change. Another issue that isn't necessarily considered part of the Port Authority's portfolio, but I would argue is, and I have argued to Chairman O'Toole and Executive Director Cotton, is congestion pricing. This is a major policy shift that's coming forward in New York. New York State passed a law allowing for charging of all vehicles to enter Manhattan south of 60th Street. Folks in New Jersey may be confused by this because they've always been paying a toll to cross the Hudson River, but realize that many drivers coming in from Long Island and Westchester and the Bronx have been coming in for free. I think congestion pricing is going to be an enormous win for New York and the metropolitan region, but the Port Authority is going to have a role to play in kind of rationalizing goods movement and traffic behavior and making sure that the tolls that it runs across the Hudson River, and especially the GW Bridge, which is outside the toll zone, are all coordinated, and so that we can eliminate toll shopping and reduce traffic congestion, improve air quality, and generate more funding for infrastructure out of this. So this is a kind of area where, again, as Martin was talking about with Gateway earlier, the Port Authority may not necessarily be in the middle of that, and yet it's going to have a vital role to play in how that policy works out and whether it's successful or not. And those are the kinds of things where it's going to do. Another one I'll throw out there is offshore wind, which is really going to be a game changer, we think. There are estimates that there could be more than 25,000 jobs generated out of this industry because the New York Bight is one of the greatest places on the planet to construct offshore wind energy. And what is it going to need? It's going to need large parcels of land on the waterfront to assemble these incredible turbines and then cart them out. It's going to require investment, permitting, land investment, all of these kind of things that the Port Authority, of course, excels in. And not to say regional coordination, because if the states are competing with each other, they won't necessarily get the greatest benefit out of this. So it's very exciting to think about the Port Authority playing a role in that. Another area, we talked quite a lot this afternoon about goods movement. Well, one of the great changes of COVID, of course, was the rise of e-commerce. And suddenly we're all purchasing things online. At UPS, they're saying it's essentially holiday season every single day, and it doesn't seem like it's ever going to decline. Well, this is putting new kinds of stresses on our goods movement system, all the way down to the micro level, where there are great debates in New York right now about whether bike lanes could be expanded and how to accommodate cargo bikes, because more and more deliveries are being made in smaller and smaller packages. I think the Port Authority is going to have a real role in shaping this and making sure that the future of e-commerce is one that is sustainable, that doesn't worsen things in terms of climate or environmental justice, and that we're able at the same time to benefit from this new type of economic activity. So there it is. It's like an equity lens, the airports, offshore wind, congestion pricing, e-commerce. And of course, I completely agree with everything that my friend Martin Robbins said about Gateway, because you just can't imagine. Gateway, I think, is the single most important infrastructure investment in the country. And it's inconceivable that it could move forward without the Port Authority playing a significant role in shaping that project as it goes forward. So I think that the last 100 years have been pretty amazing for the Port Authority. It has accomplished extraordinary things. In particular, I think it has really benefited in recent years from very, very strong leadership. And I go back not just to the terrific executive directors, and Rick Cotton, we have enormous admiration for, but even several of his predecessors, and also Chairman O'Toole and several of the people who've been in that position, but really throughout the staff. And I thought it was especially poignant to hear Rosemary talk about her experience within the agency, because it reminds us that the Port Authority is composed of talented and dedicated public servants, some of whom lost their lives on 9/11, all of whom came back and have worked hard to make it a better, stronger agency. And so I have great optimism about the future of this region, partially because of the Port Authority. And I'm very excited to see what it'll do over the next 100 years. And I think, John, I'll just end with, I look forward to your next panel and continuing these conversations to hear other folks talk about that. Thanks so much.
Tom, thank you very much. And what a great segue to sort of queuing up the notion that we have 2 more symposia that we are in the process of planning. So we'd love for you everyone to sort of keep track of the symposium series and keep track on the website, watch your emails. We will be touching on a number of the topics that Tom really just foreshadowed as the important challenges and issues that Port Authority may be grappling with in the next century. So with that, let me thank once again all of our speakers, Jim Hughes and Rosemary Scanlon this morning, the panel that we just had with great talks from Anne and John and Lynn and Martin, and certainly Tom for your closing remarks. I do also want to recognize and thank Mary Kay Murphy and Alfred Doblin from the Port Authority, who spent endless amounts of time working with us to come up with the program and coordinate the speakers. We thank them also for the opportunity to just participate as an institution in the symposium series. And I would be completely remiss if I did not thank Stephanie Coase-Crozier, who has been, as you know, coordinating all the logistics for our event today. And I thank Stephanie for all the hours she put into helping to make the event a success. With that, it is now 3:59, and we're going to bring this symposium to a close on time. I appreciate everyone staying with us this afternoon, and look forward to seeing the participation of everybody in our next set of symposia, which will happen in the fall. Thank you all, and have a great afternoon.